Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm making a video I wanted to make last year, but I just never got around to it. I want to comment on the August 2023 interview by T's Crypto Spot with Daniel Eidan, who is an advisor and solution architect for the BIS, and give my take on it. I remember at the time, many who listened to the interview felt it was a positive for XRP, and that Daniel was under NDA, which is why he couldn't outright say that the BIS is using XRP, or that mBridge was built using the XRPL, or that XRP as a bridge currency is a necessary solution. People literally ignored what he was actually saying and focused on the ambiguity, interpreting it to mean he knows it's XRP but isn't saying so because he's under NDA. However, I interpreted it completely differently. It clarified my research up to that point and confirmed what I already believed to be true. Now, the interview was nearly 2 hours long, covering topics like CBDCs, interoperability, private versus public DLT systems, bridge assets, and so on. I've only extracted the parts that I feel are most relevant to XRP, providing clarity on what Daniel actually thinks about it. So, let's get started.
So Daniel, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the crowd, we can start there.
Sure. Thank you very much. Sorry, I had a second there looking for the unmute button. So thanks for the disclaimer. I appreciate that. I don't want to disappoint the audience, but of course I have to kind of mention that, the views that I express are mine only and not necessarily the views of the institution. So just keep that in mind. And with that, I'll allow myself to speak as freely as I can, and hopefully, maybe dispel some of the myths and offer some clarity into the work that we're doing. So my name is Daniel Eidan. I'm a solution architect and advisor at the Bank for International Settlements. The Bank for International Settlements is kind of known, I'd say probably most simply known as the central bank of central banks. The real definition is a little bit more nuanced because the Bank for International Settlements is not itself a central bank. It's more of a group of central banks coming together. The Bank for International Settlements historically has served kind of two main functions. The first being a place where central bankers can come to coordinate their policy and strategic objectives. So really a place where central banks that represent individual economies can coordinate, for example, on policy changes, interest rate changes, things like that. The Bank for International Settlements also serves as a bank for central banks. So when central banks need banking services, they will often come to the BIS for those services. It's a little bit interesting thinking about a central bank needing banking services itself, but that is a necessary thing. Central banks have a balance sheet that they need to invest. They need someone to hold their funds. They need someone to do open market operations for them, things like that. So those two functions as a convening place for central bank policymakers and as a financial institution in its own right. And most recently, in the last 3 years, the Bank for International Settlement opened something that we call the Innovation Hub, which is really kind of we'll spend most of our time talking about that part of the bank. And that's when they started letting people like me into the institution. And I say like me because my background isn't central banking or actually economics per se. My background is computer science and engineering. I spent the beginning of my career firmly in that domain. So, building software and technology solutions for clients. I spent a little bit of time kind of in that world, just building tech across a wide array of industries. Then I moved into a little bit more of the educational space where I spent time doing kind of technical education in boot camp schools. After that, I spent a little bit of time I entered kind of the blockchain crypto world. This is kind of around 2016, 2017, when things were just kind of coming up. At the time, I was based out of Toronto, Canada. So actually, I was surrounded by a large influence of the crypto community that kind of came out of that Toronto at that time. Vitalik, for example, was in my computer science program actually a year or two after me. So maybe that gives a little bit of a sense of the space that I come from. And I ended up working for a company called R3 that built a platform called Corda that was one of the kind of prominent, and probably still is one of the prominent public permissioned blockchains. And through that work, I was introduced to central bank digital currency with a project with the Bank of Canada called Project Jasper. That was very early on, so maybe this is around 2018, 2019. I remember when I used to say CBDC or central bank digital currency, no one really knew what I was talking about. Fast forward a couple of years, and the Bank for International Settlement it's clear on the central bank's agenda, and hence on the Bank for International Settlement's agenda. And that's how someone with my background and profile finds themselves where I am today. So I hope that gives a little bit of context on my perspective and where I'm coming from.
After hearing Daniel's introduction, where he discusses his background, the companies he's worked with, and the BIS projects he's been a part of, we should understand that if anyone has insight into what these institutions are working on, the technology they're using for their DLT systems, and their approach to CBDC interoperability and bridging, it would be someone like Daniel.
The question is, are bridge currencies beneficial regarding cross-border payments and CBDC interoperability? What's your thoughts on that, Daniel?
This was a very good question to ask him. Essentially, T is asking whether XRP as a bridge currency is beneficial for cross-border payments and CBDC interoperability. But Daniel's response was very interesting. Let's see what he says.
Okay, so the question is, are bridge currencies more efficient, or are they beneficial regarding cross-border payments and interoperability? Okay, so let's kind of leave aside the interoperability component, because I think that people can kind of take that in different directions. So let me just kind of put interoperability aside until we can define it a little bit better, if that's okay. But let's talk about bridge currencies and what function they can provide and things like that, and I think that that's really important. I think at a high level, my answer is the market will go where the market wants to go. So a bridge currency is only useful if it provides efficiencies compared to a direct currency conversion.
Listen to what he just said. He said that a bridge currency is only useful if it provides efficiencies compared to a direct currency conversion. Now, this point is crucial. What you can conclude is that every time you see an institutional DLT project opting for a direct currency conversion, i.e., a direct swap, over a bridge currency intermediary for their CBDC swapping methods, it's because they believe it's more efficient for them. At this time, I had already spent months debunking the narrative in various debates and in my content that all CBDC swapping and bridging must involve a bridge asset like XRP. Many in the XRP community did not understand that direct swapping of CBDCs is another method that nullifies the need for a bridge asset. I had already understood this concept, so when Daniel said what he said, it was literally a "thank you, I've been telling you all along" moment for me. But because I'm not in tech, many dismissed my points, especially those who looked up to tech experts. These experts still believed, due to their knowledge gap, that all bridging requires a bridge asset like XRP. Anyway, let's continue with Daniel's response.
Okay, so what do I mean by that? I mean, if you have currencies A and B, and you effectively, these currencies are, when we think about cross-border payments, we're really talking about cross-currency payments. So let's think about, you want to move euro to yen, right? You look at the exchange rate between euro to yen, whatever is incorporated in that exchange rate, the inefficiencies of the market, the spreads, the liquidity, whatever it is that forms that price. My intuitive answer is bridge currencies will be useful if they can provide a better price than a direct currency swap. So that's it. So that's the challenge, right? Now it happens to be that, let's say from yen to euro, or from euro to yen, let's think about those two currencies. They may have sufficiently liquid market and sufficiently good price discovery mechanisms and blah, 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 blah. And there may be enough, the price there may be better than going through, let's say, the US dollar, in which case people will go directly. If the US dollar, though, in spite of the inefficiency of adding another step to the process, meaning that you would have to go, instead of from euro to yen, from euro to dollar and then to dollar to yen, making the dollar the bridge currency. If the dollar as a bridge currency can provide more efficient pricing, then people will go through the dollar. It's not, there is no ulterior motive. So I think the question now becomes, are bridge currencies needed, and can they bring efficiencies into the market? And that's an interesting question, because it depends which bridge currency we're talking about and what it's bridging between. So it's impossible to really answer the question in abstract. It's only possible to answer the question with specific bridges. So from where to where, what bridge are we talking about? And then, of course, what currency can provide the bridge? And then we can have a conversation on, and then I'd be able to give a more accurate distinction on whether or not that specific bridge currency in that specific corridor or bridge provides value or not.
If you listen to what Daniel just said, this would have been the perfect moment to cut the ambiguity and be direct. He was basically saying, tell me the bridge asset you're referring to, and I can give you a better answer on whether it would be efficient. At that moment, the question should have been asked, what is his opinion on XRP as a bridge currency compared to direct swapping mechanisms? That's what we were all there to find out, and he gave us the opportunity to ask. Bear in mind, Daniel isn't naive. He likely knew that we were all thinking of XRP, and he gave us the chance to ask him directly. Regardless, we can deduce from what he said that XRP as a bridge currency has poor liquidity compared to others like the dollar, isn't efficient for high-value payments, which central banks would need for various corridors, and hasn't proven itself to be more efficient and cheaper than direct swap mechanisms. Otherwise, institutions would have used it by now. Let's continue.
In general, though, I think if I had to answer the question in general, I would provide the following thinking. Today, if I'm not mistaken, I think between 70 to 75% of cross-border or cross-currency, let's call them payments, are done through the dollar. I think about another 20% are done through the euro. There's a little bit done through the renminbi, maybe 2 or 3%, and then the rest kind of tapers off from there. So that's the world of bridge currencies today, at least in kind of regulated markets. The reason it's like that is because those bridge currencies can provide better pricing mechanisms. So if I want to move, I don't know, I want to move Israeli shekels to Mexican pesos, well, guess what? You're probably going to go through the dollar because there isn't good enough price discovery, there isn't efficient enough trading mechanisms to do a direct currency swap between those two currencies. What is interesting with a lot of the work that we're doing and a lot of the things that we're seeing in the blockchain space is, well, actually, maybe we could create these currency corridors, these currency bridges that are compete with the efficiencies of these bridge currencies by doing actual kind of bilateral trading between two local domestic currencies. So if you look, for example, at Project MBridge, which is a multi-CBDC bridge project that I happened to run during the time that I was out of our Hong Kong office, the premise of the experiment was to kind of figure out whether or not these distributed ledger technologies could facilitate more deeper liquidity and better priced markets for direct currency conversions between each other.
I've told you before that Project MBridge isn't using XRP for bridging. If you listen to what Daniel said, he mentioned that Project MBridge could be used between countries with bilateral trade agreements for direct currency swaps. That's the method it uses for bridging. In other words, it's an alternative method to the intermediary bridge asset approach. And again, he emphasized that the US dollar is the most common bridge in the intermediary method. Another important point is that the term bridging doesn't exclusively mean a bridge asset is being used. It can also describe the direct swap mechanism, which is also a bridging method. Let's continue.
Now, I mean, we do a lot of our work is technical in nature. So as a function of that, what we do is we provide descriptions of how things work as opposed to prescriptions of how they should work. So you can think about it as we're opening up options and not necessarily and trying to understand the trade-offs between them, but we're not saying you should do this or you should do that. That's left to the countries to decide themselves. But I think one thing that we do see with distributed ledger technology is if you take two markets and you put them on distributed ledgers, you can create potential, you can kind of connect between them in ways that are, 24/7, instantly settled, more transparent, and a way that maybe promotes direct currency conversion over these kind of bridge-like currencies.
As you can see, he keeps emphasizing that direct currency conversion is used over a bridge currency as a bridging method within the platforms they're building. They clearly see it as the most efficient and cost-effective option. And although he said it's up to governments to decide what they want to do, the BIS is just giving them options. And so far, many of those options seem to heavily center around the direct swap method for currency bridging. Let's continue.
Now, that doesn't mean that the bridge currencies are going to sit there quietly, right? The bridge currencies, especially the ones that are dominant today, have everything to lose, have more to lose than anybody else. So they're also going to advance their value offerings in the economy. They have a lot of liquidity. There's a lot of money in these bridge currencies. They're huge economies in their own right, and they serve a purpose as well. So the jury's still a little bit out, but I think that all of these technologies are going to advance. We're going to get Nothing's going to stand still. So direct cross currency conversion is going to become more efficient. The bridge currencies themselves are going to become more efficient. And at the end of the day, the market's going to decide.
I think after that monologue, it's clear that Daniel believes direct currency conversions are the superior method. However, he did say that the market would decide and both swapping mechanisms would improve over time. An interesting point is that he kept referring to the US dollar as the bridge currency, not crypto. If the dollar is the dominant bridge currency today, then XRP, as a bridge asset, would be in direct competition with the dollar and would need to dethrone it to become the best bridge currency asset on the market. Would the dollar lose its hegemony as a bridge currency to XRP? That's an interesting question. It looks like XRP has a mountain to climb if it ever wants to be something significant in the bridge currency realm. On top of that, it would need to prove itself to be more efficient than the direct swap mechanism for bridging.
Thank you, Daniel. And I could go on and on about, specific technologies and bridge currencies that are rooted in crypto. But I've always kind of envisioned a world where we may get to some point in the future where countries may not trust one another. We've seen kind of this rhetoric and I'm not a banking insider, so I don't know how much of it is media propaganda and how much of it is reality. But with certain countries looking to potentially migrate away from the dollar, that's kind of what brings me to the conclusion that at some point we could see some sort of an intermediary mechanism used within the distributed ledger technology world to essentially bridge that gap regarding direct conversion of currencies, especially when we're talking about CBDCs. And in turn, what does that future look like? So I definitely appreciate the clarification, Daniel.
If you listen to what T was saying, he introduced the idea that the bridging asset could be a cryptocurrency. Up until this point, when Daniel talked about a bridge currency, he was referring to the dollar or other fiat currencies. Daniel's response convinced me that he, and likely the BIS, aren't even considering XRP as a potential solution. It seems as though XRP isn't even on their radar. The idea of a cryptocurrency being used as a bridge asset by central banking institutions instead of the dollar seemed absurd to Daniel, something he couldn't even comprehend. Listen to his reaction.
T, I'm happy to build on that a little bit if that's kind of interesting, if that's something that you've put a lot of thought into, and something that our audience are interested into more broadly. I mean, it's an interesting kind of value. It's an interesting hypothesis to say, there's this diversification in payments potentially away from the dollar, and I think that that's in general. I think that when you take that at its highest level, every economy would like to denominate more of their transactions and more of their exports in their own currency. It gives every economy more control over themselves and more autonomy. So I think the motivation of countries, independent of if they're diversifying away from the dollar or the euro or the yen or whatever it is, in general, I think that that's a well understood aspiration. Where I don't quite understand the narrative is you said rooted in crypto, and I think that there's a lot of kind of assumptions there that I don't fully understand how you make the connection between saying going from diversification of payments, which is a way of saying being more autonomous and independent and maybe less dependent on foreign currencies, which is a desirable characteristic for most countries, and then saying, well, this is going to be rooted in crypto, and somehow that provides something that I guess is kind of neutral, that if countries don't trust each other, they would trust this kind of crypto trustless ecosystem. Like, maybe we can dig into that a little bit. Maybe there's something that I don't understand, but I don't understand immediately why that would be better than I guess only depending on yourself, right? Only doing direct currency conversion. So that's where I kind of lose the narrative a little bit, and I don't really understand the reasoning behind that.
Did you hear that? Daniel doesn't understand why using a cryptocurrency would be better than just doing direct currency conversions. I'm sorry, but that was the icing on the cake for me. It proved the point I've been trying to make for a while now. Financial institutions aren't using XRP in their solutions. Instead, they're incorporating smart contract programmability and atomic settlement using direct swaps. Daniel said that when people talk about crypto as a bridge asset, it makes him lose the narrative, and he doesn't understand the reasoning behind it. Remember, he has worked for R3 and the BIS on various DLT projects. He's working on what institutions want, and he knows what they want too. He's not part of the crypto bro community that hypes public tokens like XRP as integral parts of the financial system by connecting dots that don't exist.
No worries. And part of the reason that it's probably not understood is because I'm being ambiguous and instead of direct about some of my theorizations that I've had.
I disagree. I think he clearly understood. I think he knew exactly what T was referring to when he mentioned crypto as a bridge asset for currencies. Daniel knew it meant XRP. I'm not even in tech, and I knew it was about XRP. So of course Daniel, with all his tech experience and the projects he's been part of, knew what T meant. The confusion wasn't in the ambiguity, but in the narrative itself. Daniel couldn't grasp why such a narrative holds any weight or should be taken seriously because, in his world, XRP isn't even in the conversation.
As far as direct currency conversions, my understanding in looking at a model, to my understanding, there were several conceptual models tested throughout Project Enbridge, for example, and probably some of these other, kind of permissioned ecosystem interoperability-based testings where we saw CBDCs swap directly within those permissioned environments. As far as being rooted in crypto, what I'm really getting at here is what would happen in a world where suddenly a bridge currency like the US dollar was no longer in demand. You have, and this kind of leads into one of my questions, but I'm not going to go in any particular format because we're already here. So I'll go ahead and cover it now. In a situation where we see de-dollarization being a thing, countries decide to migrate over to distributed ledger-based environments regarding their cross-border payments. And in doing so, let's say there's some sort of a unilateral agreement between several countries, right? We could use BRICS for an example. And all of those countries decide that they want to establish some sort of a closed network where they're doing direct currency swaps. And maybe there's, some sort of a smart contract application-based system that allows them to transfer payments between one another in CBDCs without having to interact with anyone else. Well, we know, per what you said earlier, and, per some of my research as well, that private or permissioned DLT ecosystems are really forked versions of public mainnet code. So let's say you see a scenario where the BRICS nations have their own version and they've all adopted Ethereum-based code for their DLT, and only they can access that. And this allows them to transmit funds between one another instantaneously regarding CBDCs. How do they communicate with someone outside of that kind of permissioned environment to conduct a cross-border payment if there's other countries that they want to do business with that reside on DLTs that are based on a different technology outside of Ethereum's.
Now, T asks a good question. To paraphrase it, he's asking if countries don't want to use the dollar and have permissioned silos built between nations, like the BRICS countries, for example. But let's say other countries have their own permissioned silos built on different technologies. How can these two closed-off silos send value to each other? The XRP community envisions XRP in the middle as a neutral bridge, or the XRPL linking the two silos as the neutral ledger. But let's see what Daniel thinks.
What's your thoughts on that, Daniel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I can answer that question, but I can give you some thinking around that. So thinking,
yeah.
When Daniel says, "I don't know if I can answer that question, but I will give you some thinking around it," many in the XRP community believed it was because he couldn't say they would be using XRP due to NDAs. However, that conclusion is unfounded, as he had already said enough to show that XRP is not a consideration. In my view, the reason Daniel said he didn't know if he could answer the question is that there is no established solution to that problem yet. Instead, there are only ideas, which is why he couldn't provide a definitive answer, but could share possible solutions.
I'll do my best. So you kind of you give an example of, okay, assume countries have these closed networks and they're private networks, and they want to do these direct currency swaps. Well, how do they communicate within each other? And to do these direct currency swaps, I think you can look at, well, I think it depends on which level of the solution stack you want to harmonize. Okay, so which ones do you want to? Which layers of the stack do they need to be connected for this communication to happen? Now, what I think is the most important layer of the stack is the value layer of the stack, meaning that, the revolution around DLT technology and the way we think about kind of the Web3 narrative is that, the internet democratized, the internet gave access to information, and blockchains are now giving access to value. So if we're talking about how do they communicate, it's not about how do I know how to pay you, you're in the US and I'm in Switzerland now, so how do we talk? Well, we're talking here on this platform so I can find you. So it's not about kind of discovery at a messaging level. It's really about how do I take value that is associated with me, be it Swiss francs or gold tokens or whatever, and transfer them to you kind of directly, I think that's what you mean when you say communicate. It's really, if you live on a different technology than I live in, and I want to send you money, or more abstractly, I want to send you value, it could be stocks or bonds or equity in a company, how can I send that to you directly? And I don't really think we're going to reinvent the wheel, and I'm not sure there needs to be a technical harmonization of standards. And if there is technical harmonization of standards, what may happen is that technical harmonization may just become kind of a commoditized in its own right. Meaning that, like, if we think about this Twitter Spaces call, it's like no one cares about the fact, or I shouldn't say no one cares, I say, to what degree is it relevant that we are, well, we're all on Twitter. So that's some degree of, that's already not interoperable. We have to be on the same platform to have this conversation. But, I could be calling you from my iPhone and you could be on your Android, and that's okay. But I would argue that kind of really doesn't matter, right? As long as we're able to communicate somehow, the underlying implementation could actually be a complete mess. It may cost service providers, and that may be externalized, but you and I don't really care about it as long as it can happen. And that's what's important. So if we think about, you painted this picture of, well, if every country's on different blockchains, how are we going to communicate, or how are we going to share value? There may be a role for an infrastructure connector in between, but then that infrastructure connector is a bottleneck as well, right? Then that becomes now the point of focus. And if we look at like issues in the crypto space, a lot of these bridges between protocols are where a lot of the security vulnerabilities come up, because you're kind of connecting between two protocols that weren't originally designed to connect. Now you could say, okay, well, why don't we design something that connects everybody all the time? And maybe that makes sense, but the risk factor there as well is that negative shocks that can happen, issues that can happen, now have a spillover effect to entire systems that I think you're proposing can span across the entire globe, right? There's a reason that the internet is built as a completely distributed system, because no one can kind of take down the entire thing. Now, if there is a technology that can be distributed like that doesn't have a single provider, that doesn't have an incentive that can be gamed to a specific corner, like the internet. And that's what I mean when I say kind of commoditized, right? Like no one there isn't a two-sided market around TCP/IP protocols the same way that there is around providing consensus mechanisms for Ethereum mainnet, for example. There's a real business model behind providing consensus for different blockchains, right? So there's an incentive there, and if there's an incentive, that means that it's subjective to market factors, and if those market factors don't play out correctly, that can jeopardize the system. So when we think about that at a global level, I'm not even really sure that that's desirable. So when you frame that like, how can we move value between each other? And T, I apologize if I'm reframing your question. You stated, how do we communicate? I think a more specific version of the same question is, how do we move value efficiently between different systems? There could be a role to play for bridges. There could be a role to play for completely distributed systems. But I would kind of argue that if that plays out, it would become much less interesting than the ecosystem is today, when we think about this ecosystem as a place that's like lucrative to provide services, because effectively it will be commoditized and turned into, I don't want to say nothing, but the people that invented TCP/IP aren't going home rich. The people that invented RSA aren't going home rich. Like these utility like commodity functions that we are using right now as we speak, they're not that interesting, because there isn't money there, because they're a commodity and everybody uses them, and they're completely open and available and accessible standards. They're more standards than they are individual proprietary technology that has a market around it. So that's just a little bit of my kind of intuitive thinking. I'm not sure if I did a good job answering your question at all.
One solution Daniel offers is an infrastructure connector between different DLT systems. However, such an infrastructure connector could become a bottleneck, introducing risks to the financial system if it were to fail. He then suggests that if there were a decentralized distributed system, like the internet, without a single service provider or an incentive structure that could be exploited, it would be a more desirable solution. However, such a solution may be less appealing because it wouldn't be as lucrative. There wouldn't be any money to be made from it. He gave the example of TCP/IP, which is the backbone of the internet that everyone uses today. The inventor didn't become rich because it is an open available standard for everyone to use. He also provided examples of solutions like bridges, distributed systems, and open standards that are accessible to everyone without proprietary technologies or incentive-driven markets. So instead of providing a concrete solution, Daniel shared the idea of open standards that are free, accessible, and available for everyone to use, like TCP/IP, without the presence of an incentivized market that could be manipulated. This is a potential solution for the problem of DLTs transmitting value across different silos built on different technologies. This reminds me of ISO TC 307, which focuses on creating standards for blockchain and distributed ledger technology, similar to how ISO 20022 standardizes payment messaging for institutions to streamline and make payment messaging interoperable, regardless of the underlying payment infrastructure technology. Let's continue.
That's just a little bit of my kind of intuitive thinking. I'm not sure if I did a good job answering your question at all.
And that actually, since we're talking about technologies, that brings me to one of my other questions. And, if you could speak on it, I'd love to hear your answers. what models, or what I should say is what technologies were used during the conceptual testing for mBridge?
T's next question is interesting as there's a lot of misinformation circulating, claiming that mBridge was built using XRPL technology as a model. I've already debunked this as false. But let's see what Daniel has to say.
That's a great question. Well, we're using a lot of distributed ledger technology. So you asked specifically about mBridge. And like I said, mBridge was a project that I spent quite some time running, and it was probably one of the most advanced cross-border blockchain experiments in the central banking world. mBridge was an evolution of a project called Inthenon Line Rock, and Inthenon Line Rock was an evolution of a project that was Inthenon on its own and Line Rock on its own. So Inthenon was a project that was run by the Central Bank of Thailand that had to do with wholesale markets, CBDC for wholesale markets. Line Rock was the equivalent thing in Hong Kong. Then a project formed called, with the very, it can give you an insight into how creative the central banking community is. They took Project Inthenon and Project Line Rock and they called it Project Inthenon Line Rock. And they created a bridge between Hong Kong and Thailand to look at this cross-border payment, creating an interoperable bridge between those two countries. And then the People's Bank of China and the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates joined the project. The BIS Innovation Hub joined the project, and that's when we rephrased it into this Project mBridge. The third phase of the project used technology that was actually a distributed ledger technology that was. The first phase of the project of Inthenon Line Rock was built on R3's Corda, and that was my first kind of interaction with the project. That was still at the time when I was at R3. The next phase of the project was built on Hyperledger Besu, and the work there was done a lot with a partnership with Consensus. And then the third iteration of the project and the most recent iteration of the project was done on technology that was provided by the PBOC.
Daniel explained that the first phase of the mBridge project was built using R3 Corda, the next phase on Hyperledger Besu, and the third phase used technology provided by the PBOC. They'll see where the fourth iteration takes them. At no point did Daniel mention anything about Ripple or the XRPL as part of the mBridge project. Despite this clear clarification, I still saw the XRP community spreading misinformation a few months later, claiming that mBridge used Ripple's technology. They cited a video of James Wallace mentioning both mBridge and Ripple, but 99% of the community misunderstood what he was actually saying. I even tried to clarify my interpretation of James Wallace's remarks, as it didn't suggest that mBridge used Ripple's technology if you actually listened to what he was saying. Anyway, maybe I'll do another video on that. Let's continue.
Perfect. If you have any questions, go ahead and send a speaker's request, and I will accept it. And you can go ahead and ask your questions. So we'll give it just a moment. Go ahead, brother. What do you have for us?
T, I would love to thank you for creating this space and creating this opportunity to speak to this great gentleman, Daniel. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing information with us.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
Really appreciate you. I just wanted to ask, I noticed earlier you did mention about the importance of price when transferring one currency to another currency when dealing with cross-border payments. Are there any digital assets that you see that are a solution to that problem that would work effectively? I'm not any type of maxi or partial to this or this or this. I do listen to T. I do listen to certain techies, and I do my own research, and I see how this works, and this works. So when it comes to digital assets, I know you mentioned like a XRP. I think there's like another one called XLM. There's probably other ones as well. Are there any that you see as a solution?
The question being asked next is basically, is XRP a solution as a bridge to solve the inefficiencies and costs of cross-border payments? I don't know why everyone danced around the issue when it came to XRP instead of just asking him outright. But anyway, let's hear Daniel's response.
And sorry, the solution to the problem being moving value from one place to the other.
Well,
Is that the problem?
so
Or
earlier,
like cross-border payments?
correct. Yeah. Earlier, T had asked you a question, and you said, I think one of the main important things for taking one currency and sending it as a cross-border payment to another country is the fact that it'll depend on price, it'll depend on things like that. So I was just wondering, do you know of any digital assets that you look at or you've studied that could be solutions to that problem right there? Thank you so much.
When you listen to Daniel's response, you can tell he seems confused by this restrictive, narrow narrative that the solution has to involve a digital crypto asset. You can see he wants to step back from that limited viewpoint and address the question more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Well, you frame the question as are there digital assets that can help with this solution? Maybe I'll generalize and say, are there solutions to this problem? And there's a lot of them. Some of those solutions include a digital asset as a cross, kind of like the equivalent of that third-party currency. It could be a third-party digital asset. So if you generalize and say, I'm trying to move value from one system to the other, I can either do it directly. Maybe it's inefficient to do it directly, so I'm going to do it indirectly. What can I do? Well, I can do many things. I mean, like even things like cross-border payment services like Western Union or MoneyGram or Wise or things like that. Like those are all solutions. They have nothing to do with digital assets, but they're solutions. They're just intermediaries saying, hey, I'll have an account in one system, I'll have an account in another system, and I'll buy and sell out of these two systems and provide these kind of cross-border services, right? And those work. I mean, they work to a certain extent, but they also cost money because there's operating costs. So now there's assets that are saying, well, actually, you can convert from one currency to my digital asset, and then my digital asset to this other currency, and effectively my digital asset serves as a bridge currency or as a cross currency. And yeah, those can work as well, but to a certain degree, whatever value you see in that solution is going to cost the user as well. And if that solution is if you squeeze all the value out of that solution and just make it totally free, well, that all of a sudden becomes not interesting at all, at least for the proponents of the solution, from a commercial standpoint. So I don't necessarily see a preference. Well, let me think how I can phrase this correctly. I think it's interesting applying different models to solve the problem. One model is kind of old school. You can keep accounts in all these different currencies, and then you basically, as a solution provider, are using your own balance sheet and taking the conversion risk on yourself. Or you can say, actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put a digital asset in the system. Someone else can own the digital asset, and the utility of this digital asset is that it's used as an exchange between these two currencies. That can work as well, but that's effectively the equivalent of saying, at least if we zoom in on the digital asset component of this, that's effectively like saying this digital asset has advantages compared to other currencies. And that's an interesting kind of claim to make, right? If you would say, if you want to move currency A to currency B, the best way to do that is through digital asset XYZ, it's going to be an interesting time trying to compete with, the US dollar or the euro or, these other things that have been built up over time, that are used as a safe store of value, that have access to all these systems. I mean, that's just a competitive landscape. And if you can put an asset in the marketplace that can cut the cost because it's so much more efficient and can be stable and accessible and resilient and and all those things, that's great. I mean, then people will flock to that solution because you're providing value. But I mean, it's an open, competitive marketplace, and I think when you look at the state of cross-border payments at the moment, that value proposition hasn't really manifested itself in any significant way in the markets yet. Could it happen? Maybe, but I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that. I mean, it could happen. I don't think it's happened yet.
Thank you so much.
Daniel goes on to explain that there are many ways to approach the problem. You can do it directly, but if that's inefficient, you can use a third-party intermediary that holds account balances for each currency you want to convert. Or, you can use a digital asset as an intermediary for bridging, which could work. However, if you focus solely on the digital asset component, that asset would need to be more advantageous than other digital currencies. He believes that any digital asset trying to act as a bridge would face stiff competition from more established, trusted, and liquid currencies like the dollar and euro, for instance. For a digital asset to be competitive as a bridge, it would need to reduce costs, be more stable, efficient, accessible, resilient, and so on, in order to be a viable contender that attracts market interest by offering real value. However, Daniel does not think that such a value proposition has manifested itself in any significant way in the cross-border payment market yet. He acknowledges that it could happen, but he didn't sound too optimistic about a digital asset becoming a strong competitor against established digital currencies. To conclude, I think Daniel clarified many myths and hopeful speculations surrounding XRP. First, he made it clear multiple times that there are several ways to solve the problem of cross-border payments between currencies. If we break it down, there are two main methods: direct swaps and intermediary bridging. The market will ultimately choose the most efficient and cost-effective solution. There's no need for an intermediary bridge if the direct swap between currency pairs is more efficient and cheaper than adding a third-party currency in the middle. He also pointed out that the intermediary bridging method is largely dominated by established fiat currencies, like the dollar and euro. The idea of a digital asset like XRP replacing these fiat currencies as a bridge seemed odd or far-fetched to him. Nonetheless, he entertained the idea and explained that if a digital asset were to succeed as a bridge, it would have to compete and prove itself more efficient and cost-effective than the established fiat currencies already in use. While it's possible that such a scenario could happen one day, it hasn't happened yet. From everything Daniel has said, it doesn't look too promising for a digital asset like XRP to become integral to the financial system. The challenges XRP would have to overcome to remain relevant as an intermediary bridging asset are immense, especially when direct swap mechanisms are becoming more efficient, potentially eliminating the need for an intermediary currency altogether. He also debunked the myth that mBridge was created using Ripple technology. Anyway, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so as to not miss my next video.